The Wyoming sun was a merciless hammer, beating the dust of the trail into a fine, blinding powder. It clung to the sweat-slicked flanks of the horses and coated the canvas roof of the Concord stagecoach, which lurched and rattled through the vast, silent canvas of ochre and rust. Inside, the four passengers endured the journey with the grim patience of travelers who knew the frontier offered no comfort. Without warning, the world erupted into chaos. The crack of a rifle split the air, sharp and final. One of the lead horses screamed and fell, tangling the harness and bringing the coach to a grinding, violent halt. Before the dust had settled, horsemen emerged from the heat shimmer of the plains, their faces obscured by bandanas, their rifles held with practiced ease. The shotgun guard, a young man barely out of his teens, never had a chance. A second shot threw him from his seat, his weapon clattering uselessly onto the trail. The driver, a grizzled veteran with sun-crinkled eyes, raised his hands in a gesture of weary surrender. The leader of the bandits dismounted, moving with a fluid grace that spoke of military training, not common thuggery. He was tall, his shoulders broad beneath a dusty duster. A long, puckered scar ran from his left temple down his cheek, a pale line against his sun-darkened skin. His eyes, cold and intelligent above the bandana, missed nothing. "The strongbox," he said, his voice a low drawl, educated and calm. It was not a request. The driver, his hands still high, nodded toward the lockbox bolted beneath his seat. "Take it. Just don't hurt the passengers." The scarred man ignored him, gesturing to his men. Two of them efficiently broke the lock and hauled the heavy box to the ground, while a third kept his rifle trained on the coach door. The leader, however, did not seem interested in the payroll. His gaze was fixed on the coach itself. He moved to the door and pulled it open, his cold eyes scanning the terrified faces within: a drummer from Chicago, a land agent from Cheyenne, and a young couple heading west to start a new life. "Wallets, jewelry," now he commanded. His men worked quickly, relieving the passengers of their valuables. The young woman tearfully handed over her wedding band. The drummer surrendered a gold watch. The scarred man watched, his expression unreadable, until one of his men presented him with the collected loot. He sifted through it with disdain, until his fingers closed on a small silver locket taken from the young woman. He opened it, glanced at the tiny portraits inside, and tossed it back into the bag. It wasn't what he was looking for. His eyes returned to the coach's cargo, a stack of mail bags and personal trunks strapped to the rear. "Unload it," he ordered. His men tore into the luggage, ripping open trunks and scattering their contents onto the dusty trail. Dresses, books, and personal effects were tossed aside with brutal indifference. The leader stepped among the debris, his boots crushing a child's doll underfoot. He nudged a splintered crate with his toe, then another, his search methodical, focused. He was not looking for random valuables. He was looking for something specific. Finally, he found it, a small leather-bound satchel, unassuming and plain. He untied the flap and reached inside his hand, emerging with a silver locket far simpler and more worn than the one he had discarded. It was oval, its surface tarnished with age, etched with the faint image of a single wildflower. He clicked it open. Inside, on one side, was a miniature portrait of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. On the other, a tiny, intricate lock of her dark hair. A flicker of something triumph, perhaps, or a darker satisfaction crossed his features. He pocketed the locket, not with the rest of the loot, but in a separate pocket inside his duster, a personal prize. "We're done here," he announced, his voice unchanged. He mounted his horse, the stolen locket, a hidden weight against his chest. As his men galloped away with the strongbox, he reined in for a moment, looking back, not at the terrified passengers, but down the trail toward the distant, hazy outline of the town of Silver Creek. The robbery had been an act of violence. the theft an act of war, and the message he was certain would be received. The news of the robbery reached Sheriff Jack Foster as a frantic drumbeat of hooves. He was in his office, a sparse room that smelled of sawdust and strong coffee, attempting to repair a broken hinge on Sophie's music box. The delicate work required a patience he rarely felt these days, but for his daughter he would try. Deputy Collins burst through the door, his face pale beneath a sheen of sweat. "Sheriff, the noon stage from Cheyenne. It's been hit. 5 miles out on the Alkali Flats. Driver says the guard's dead." The music box fell from Jack's hands, its half-mended tune silenced. He was on his feet in an instant, the reluctant lawman replaced by the decisive commander he had once been. "Get Doc Mitchell. Gather a posse of 3 good men. No more. I don't want a mob. Meet me at the livery in 5 minutes." As the deputy scrambled to obey, Jack strapped on his gun belt. The Colt Peacemaker felt heavy on his hip, a familiar but unwelcome weight. He had taken the sheriff's star 3 years ago, out of a sense of duty, a promise to his late wife Rachel to help build a safe community for their daughter, but he had never learned to love the violence that came with it. He rode hard, the Wyoming wind a dry rasp against his face. The scene at the Alkali Flats was exactly as he'd pictured: the dead horse, the splintered strongbox, the passengers huddled together, their faces a mixture of shock and relief. But it was the sight of their belongings strewn across the dirt that made his blood run cold. This was more than a robbery. This was a violation. He dismounted, his eyes sweeping the scene with a tracker's intensity. He noted the number of horsemen from the tracks, the caliber of the rifles from the spent cartridges, the military precision of the operation. These were not desperate outlaws. "Sheriff Foster," the driver said, his voice shaky. They were professionals, knew exactly what they were doing. Jack knelt, examining the ransacked luggage. A woman's dress, a man's ledger, a child's toy. Then he saw the splintered remains of a small leather satchel, its contents scattered. It was a mail pouch, but a private one, entrusted to the stage line for a personal delivery. And Jack knew with a certainty that felt like a physical blow what had been inside. He had packed it himself just last week, sending some of Rachel's most precious keepsakes to her sister in California. Among them, the silver locket he had given her on their wedding day. His carefully constructed composure fractured. He sifted through the debris, his fingers tracing the empty indentation in the satchel's velvet lining where the locket had rested for years. It was gone. "Did you see who took it?" he asked the passengers, his voice dangerously quiet. The young woman, the one who had lost her wedding band, spoke up. "The leader? The one with the scar." He looked through everything, but he only took one thing for himself. A small silver locket from that bag. She pointed a trembling finger at the ruined satchel. "He took it like it was what he came for." Jack's world narrowed to a single point of cold, silent fury. This was not random. This was a message. Someone from his past had reached into his present and stolen the one thing that tied him to the woman who had saved his soul. He stood, his gaze turning to the tracks leading away into the wilderness. He was no longer just Sheriff Foster investigating a crime. He was Jack Foster, a man whose sanctuary had been invaded, whose most sacred memory had been desecrated. He continued his examination of the scene, his grief channeled into a razor-sharp focus. He found what the others had missed. Near the spot where the leader had dismounted, almost hidden in the dust, was a small brass button. It was tarnished, but the insignia was unmistakable. A caduceus, the symbol of a medical corps. And below it the letters CSA, Confederate States Army. The clue made no sense. A common bandit wouldn't carry a relic from a lost war. But a man with a specific grudge, a man with a connection to that war and by extension to Jack's own hidden history might. He pocketed the button, the small piece of brass feeling as heavy as a cannonball in his hand. The past was no longer a ghost in his nightmares. It had ridden into his life on horseback and declared war. And Jack knew with chilling certainty that he would have to become the man he had tried so hard to bury in order to fight back. Silver Creek in 1877 was a town caught between eras, a precarious island of civilization in a vast sea of unforgiving territory. Its main street was a wide ribbon of packed earth, flanked by the skeletal frames of unfinished buildings that stood as monuments to both ambition and failure. The wind, a constant presence, whispered through them, carrying tales of broken dreams and the persistent Wyoming dust. For Jack Foster, the town was a haven. Here he was simply the sheriff, a quiet widower, raising his daughter. Here the ghosts of the war were kept at bay by the simple demanding rhythms of frontier life. His home was a modest but solid house at the edge of town with actual glass windows and a porch where he and his 10-year-old daughter Sophie would watch the stars ignite in the immense dark sky. Sophie was Rachel's legacy, a living embodiment of the goodness Jack fought to protect. She had her mother's perceptive eyes and a spirit as resilient as the wildflowers that clung to the rocky soil. She was the reason he pinned on the sheriff's star each morning, the reason he endured the drunks and the disputes, the reason he kept the darkness of his past locked away. That evening, the stolen locket was a physical ache in his chest. As he sat with Sophie on the porch, he found himself touching the empty pocket where he usually kept it. It had been his connection to Rachel, a tangible piece of the peace she had brought him. Now its absence was a constant, terrifying reminder of his new vulnerability. "What's wrong, Daddy?" Sophie asked, her voice pulling him from his thoughts. She was too perceptive for her age, a trait she had also inherited from her mother. Jack forced a smile. "Just thinking, sweetheart. It was a long day." "Because of the robbery," she pressed. "Mrs. Hollister said it was terrible." It was, Jack admitted. "But everyone is safe now except for the guard. That's what matters." He didn't tell her about the locket. He couldn't bear to see the shadow of his own loss reflected in her eyes. The locket was his burden to recover, his fight to wage. His nights were often restless, filled with fragmented dreams of the war. They were never clear memories, but unsettling images of confusion, of overwhelming artillery fire, of the suffocating smell of gunpowder and mud, and a profound, unshakable sense of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. He would wake in a cold sweat, the phantom thunder of cannons echoing in his ears, and would have to walk out onto the porch just to remind himself that he was in Wyoming, that 12 years had passed, and that the war was over. He thought it was over. 2 days after the robbery, the town's fragile peace was disturbed by a different kind of invasion. A sound Silver Creek had only heard in rumors and newspaper reports, the piercing whistle of a locomotive sliced through the morning air. An opulent private train, all polished brass and gleaming black iron, hissed to a stop at the town's humble platform. From its most luxurious car emerged Colonel Walter Blackwell, director of the Union Pacific Railroad, a man Jack had not seen since the final bloody days at Appomattox. Blackwell was a name from another life, a name spoken in hushed tones, in canvas tents, a name synonymous with whispered orders and missions that never appeared in any official record. He was Jack's former commander, the architect of the covert unit, in which Captain Jack Foster had served as one of the Union's most effective assassins. The town greeted Blackwell as a hero, a titan of industry bringing progress and prosperity in his wake. Mayor Simmons delivered a fawning speech. Business owners jostled for an introduction. Only Jack saw the man beneath the impeccably tailored suit, a master manipulator, a strategist who viewed people as assets and obstacles pieces to be moved on a grand chessboard. And Blackwell saw him. Amid the crowd, the colonel's sharp eyes found Jack's, and a flicker of recognition, followed by a swift, calculating assessment, passed between them. The past had arrived not on horseback, but in a private rail car, and its intentions were no less hostile. Later that day, a summons came. The colonel requested a private meeting at the hotel. The dining room had been cleared. Blackwell sat alone, a glass of whiskey in his hand, and the very picture of civilized power. A lean, watchful man Jack recognized from the platform, Derek Sullivan, Blackwell's personal secretary, stood by the door. "Captain Foster Blackwell," said his voice, as commanding as Jack remembered. "Or is it Sheriff Foster now?" An unexpected turn of events. "Plans change," Colonel Jack replied, his own voice, gruff, concise. "Indeed they do." Blackwell's smile was a thin, predatory curve. "I trust your particular skills are not required in a peaceful town like this. The war is best left buried, don't you think? The threat was veiled but unmistakable." Blackwell knew everything, and he would not hesitate to use that knowledge. "I enforce the law," Jack said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "Of course you do." Blackwell leaned forward, his voice dropping. "And I am here to help this town, to bring it into the modern age. The Union Pacific is a force for civilization, Sheriff. We are building a nation. I would hope that the local law enforcement would see the wisdom in cooperating with that grand project for everyone's sake." The meeting was a declaration. Blackwell intended to reshape Silver Creek to his own design, and he expected Jack's compliance. The choice was clear: stand with Blackwell and protect his secrets, or stand against him and risk having the life he had built so carefully shattered into pieces. As Jack left the hotel, the weight of that choice settled on him, as heavy and cold as the stolen locket he was so desperate to recover. He now had two wars to fight: one against the ghosts of his past, who had just stolen his future's most precious memento, and one against the man who had created those ghosts in the first place. The first skirmish in Blackwell's campaign for Silver Creek's soul was not fought with guns, but with deeds and dollars. The target was Ezekiel Wilson, a prospector whose gnarled hands and sun-leathered face told the story of a life spent chasing glimmers in the dirt. His claim, a worthless-looking stretch of land along the shallow, meandering Miller's Creek, had yielded little more than subsistence for 30 years. It also happened to lie directly in the path of the railroad's proposed spur line. The confrontation took place in broad daylight, a piece of theater for the whole town to witness. Marcus Blackwell, the colonel's son, swaggered onto Wilson's claim, flanked by two hard-faced men. He carried a leather portfolio and an air of entitled arrogance, viewing the old prospector as little more than an insect to be brushed aside. "Wilson," Marcus began, his voice laced with the condescending patience of a man unused to being denied. "My father has made you a generous offer for this useless patch of dirt. $500. More than you've made in a decade. Sign the papers." Ezekiel Wilson, who had been patiently panning at the creek's edge, straightened his aching back. His eyes, though old, were sharp and clear. "This ain't just dirt, Sonny. It's my home. I ain't selling." "Don't be a fool, old man," Marcus sneered. "Progress is coming. You can either take the money and get out of the way, or you'll be removed. Makes no difference to us." The commotion had drawn onlookers, including Jack, who had been making his rounds. He watched from a distance, his hand resting near his holster, his presence a quiet but firm reminder of the law. "This land is mine by claim and by right." Ezekiel said, his voice rising with defiance. "I was here before there was a town, before your fancy railroad even existed. You can't just—" "I can." Marcus interrupted, stepping forward until he loomed over the smaller man. "And I will." One of his men nudged Ezekiel's shoulder, a casual shove meant to intimidate. That was enough. Jack moved forward, his steps unhurried but deliberate. The small crowd parted for him. "Is there a problem here, Mr. Blackwell?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying a steel edge. Marcus turned, irritation flashing in his eyes. This is a private business matter, Sheriff. It becomes my business when your men put their hands on a citizen of this town. Jack said, his gaze shifting to the hired muscle. That's assault. He then looked back at Marcus. Mr. Wilson has stated he doesn't wish to sell. I suggest you respect his decision. Respect. Marcus laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. My father's railroad has been granted right-of-way by the territorial government. We have the authority of eminent domain. This old fool is obstructing progress. Then you'll have to take it up with Judge Parker and the territorial court, Jack stated flatly. Until you have a court order, you are trespassing on Mr. Wilson's property. I'm asking you to leave. Once. For a tense moment, Marcus seemed to consider challenging him. His hand twitched, as if thinking of the pistol holstered under his expensive coat. But something in Jack's steady, unwavering gaze, the look of a man who had faced down far worse threats than an arrogant boy, made him reconsider. He glared at Jack, his face a mask of thwarted rage. This isn't over, Sheriff, he spat. You've just made a very powerful enemy. I'll add it to the list, Jack replied without expression. Marcus and his men retreated, leaving a wake of simmering hostility. Ezekiel Wilson nodded his thanks to Jack, his relief palpable. Appreciate that, Sheriff. Knew you were a good man the day you took the star. Jack simply nodded, but as he watched Marcus ride away, he knew the confrontation had set something irreversible in motion. He had drawn a line in the dust, publicly siding with the people of Silver Creek against the immense power of the Union Pacific. It was a righteous stand, the only one he could have made, but it came with a cost. He had not just made an enemy of Marcus. He had defied the colonel himself. That evening, Walter Blackwell summoned him again. This time the pretense of collegiality was gone. My son tells me you interfered in a legitimate business transaction today. Blackwell began, his voice cold. Your son threatened an old man on his own property, Jack corrected. I upheld the law. The law, Blackwell gave a dismissive wave of his hand. The law is a tool, Sheriff, to be used to achieve a greater good. That spur line is the future of this town. That old man's sentimentality is an obstacle to the prosperity of hundreds. You chose to protect the past over the future. He rose from his desk and walked to a large map pinned to the wall, where the proposed route was marked in a bold red line. I find myself in a difficult position, Blackwell said, turning back to face Jack. There has been suspicious activity around Miller's Creek. Men watching our survey crews. I believe they may be claim jumpers, or perhaps agents of a rival railroad. I need someone with your unique skills to investigate. Quietly. Jack recognized the maneuver for what it was, a test of loyalty, a gilded cage. Blackwell was offering him a way back into his good graces, a chance to work for him to become an asset once more. The offer was a double-edged sword. Refusing would confirm his opposition. Accepting would compromise his integrity as sheriff, making him an employee of the very man threatening his town. But it also offered an opportunity. I'll look into it. Jack said, his tone neutral. As sheriff, any potential threat to this town's development is my concern. Blackwell smiled thinly, recognizing Jack's careful positioning. As you wish, Sheriff. Just bring me results. Jack spent the next 2 days investigating, but his focus was not on Blackwell's phantom claim jumpers. He rode the perimeter of Miller's Creek, his tracker's eyes missing nothing. He found no evidence of rival agents, but he did find something else. Hidden beneath a pile of rocks, far from the prying eyes of the main trail, was a discarded survey map. It was not a railroad map. The markings were geological, denoting strata fault lines and mineral composite readings. A bold circle was drawn around Miller's Creek, and more significantly, the land to the west of it, encompassing the old town cemetery. He also revisited the site of the stagecoach robbery. He walked the ground again, replaying the events in his mind. The cold efficiency, the targeted theft of the locket, the Confederate Medical Corps button. The pieces didn't fit a simple payroll heist. As he knelt where the leader's horse had stood, his fingers brushed against something metallic buried in the dust. It was another button identical to the first. Dropping one could be an accident. Dropping two in the heat of a robbery was carelessness bordering on incompetence, something the leader had decidedly not been. Unless it wasn't carelessness. Unless it was a message, a breadcrumb left for him and only him to find. His investigation was punctuated by quiet moments with Catherine Mitchell. The town's doctor, an educated woman from Boston, had become a confidant. Like him, she was an outsider who carried the invisible scars of the war. She had served as a nurse at Antietam and Petersburg, and her eyes held the same weary knowledge as his own. "There's more to Blackwell's plan than a simple railroad spur," he told her one evening, as they sat on her small balcony overlooking the town. He showed her the geological map. Catherine traced the circle on the map with her finger. "This area? It's the old cemetery and Ezekiel's claim. Why would they survey this land so intensely?" "That's what I intend to find out," Jack said. "Blackwell's playing a different game, and the town is just the board." "Be careful, Jack," she warned, her hand resting briefly on his arm. The touch was light, but it conveyed a depth of concern that resonated within him. Men like Blackwell don't just build railroads. They crush whatever stands in their way. He knew she was right. He was no longer just reacting to threats. He was actively moving against a man who commanded armies and fortunes. He was gathering evidence, building a case, preparing for a confrontation he knew was inevitable. He was walking into a war, and this time he was fighting for his home. The fuse that Jack had lit by arresting Marcus Blackwell ignited with terrifying speed. Blackwell's power was not just in his wealth or his political connections. It was in the network of ruthless men who served his interests. Retaliation was not a possibility. It was an inevitability. It came that night, aimed not at Jack himself, but at the heart of Silver Creek, at the one thing he held more precious than his own life. The first sign of trouble was the orange glow against the night sky, followed by the frantic, panicked ringing of the church bell. Fire. Jack was on the porch cleaning his rifle, the cold metal a familiar comfort in his hands. He saw the glow and was moving before the first bell chime had faded his gut, twisting with a sudden, sickening premonition. The flames were rising from the north end of town. From the schoolhouse. He ran his long legs, eating up the distance, his heart hammering against his ribs. The town was already in motion. Men emerging from the saloon with buckets, women shouting in alarm. But Jack outpaced them all, his mind, a maelstrom of a single terrifying thought: Sophie. When he arrived, the schoolhouse was an inferno. Flames licked up the dry timber walls and poured from the windows like a vision of hell. Mrs. Hollister, the schoolteacher, stood with a group of sobbing children, her face blackened with soot, her eyes wild with panic. "They're not all out," she cried, grabbing Jack's arm. "Sophie and two others. They were in the back in the library corner. We can't find them." The world narrowed to the burning building and the sound of his daughter's name. He saw a small, desperate crowd attempting a bucket brigade, their efforts hopelessly inadequate. He saw the front door engulfed in a solid wall of fire. He also saw the small service door at the rear, not yet consumed. "Jack, you can't," a voice yelled. But he was already moving, pulling his bandana over his nose and mouth. He sprinted toward the rear of the building, the heat so intense it felt like a physical blow. He kicked the back door in and plunged into the choking, blinding smoke. Inside, the roar of the fire was deafening. He dropped to his knees where the air was a fraction clearer and crawled forward, shouting Sophie's name until his throat was raw. Burning timbers crashed down around him. The heat was a living thing, searing his skin, stealing the air from his lungs. He navigated by memory, his mind fixed on the small library corner where Sophie loved to read. He found them huddled in a small supply closet, the door blocked by a fallen bookcase. Through the smoke, he could see their small, terrified faces. He threw the burning bookcase aside with a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength and wrenched the door open. Daddy Sophie's cry was a half-sob, half-gasp. "I've got you," he said, his voice a ragged rasp. He gathered all three children, shielding them with his body. "Stay low. Follow me." A tremendous groan from above signaled the imminent collapse of the roof. He shoved the children toward a window, its glass already shattered by the heat. He pushed the first two through, then lifted Sophie. As she scrambled out, a heavy roof beam crashed down, striking him across the back and driving him to his knees. The pain was blinding, but the sight of Sophie safe on the other side of the window gave him the strength to rise. He lunged through the opening an instant before the entire roof caved in behind him in a cataclysmic roar of flame and splintering wood. He landed hard on the ground outside, rolling to extinguish the embers on his clothes. Hands helped him to his feet. Through the haze of smoke and pain, he saw Catherine Mitchell kneeling beside Sophie, her medical bag open. She had arrived, a beacon of calm in the chaos. "She's all right, Jack," Catherine said, her voice steady and reassuring as he stumbled toward them. "They all are. Some smoke inhalation, but no burns. You got them out just in time." He knelt and pulled Sophie into a fierce embrace, burying his face in her hair, inhaling the scent of her, reassuring himself that she was real, that she was safe. "A man locked us in." Tommy Watson, one of the other children, choked out between coughs. He laughed. Jack's blood ran cold. He looked at Catherine, and her eyes reflected his own dawning horror. This was no accident. This was a message. As if to confirm it, Derek Sullivan, Blackwell's ever-present shadow, appeared at the edge of the crowd. He approached Jack, his expression unreadable. "A terrible tragedy," Sheriff Sullivan said, his voice devoid of emotion. "The Colonel sends his deepest sympathies." He paused, then added, "While you were occupied here, there was an unfortunate incident at the jail. Marcus Blackwell attempted to escape. He was shot while resisting arrest." The words hung in the air, cold and precise. Marcus, the catalyst, the liability, was gone. Eliminated. Sullivan hadn't saved the town. He had cleaned up a loose end for his employer. The fire, Jack realized, hadn't just been a message. It had been a diversion. A brutal, calculated maneuver to provide cover for an execution. The lines were now drawn in blood and ash. This was no longer about land or gold. Blackwell, through his agents, had tried to murder his daughter. He had declared a total war, demonstrating that there was no line he would not cross, no atrocity he would not sanction in the pursuit of his ambition. Jack stood holding Sophie's hand tightly in his own. The sheriff who had tried to build a peaceful life was gone, burned away in the schoolhouse fire. In his place stood Captain Foster, the man forged in the crucible of a different, more honest war. And he knew that to protect his daughter and his town, he would have to do more than enforce the law. He would have to hunt down the men responsible and deliver a justice that no courtroom could provide. The grief for a son he never loved did not slow Colonel Blackwell. The fire was a setback, the death of Marcus, a regrettable but necessary piece of bookkeeping. The true objective remained the gold beneath Silver Creek. But now, with Jack Foster a declared enemy, the game had changed. The pretense of law and order was an inconvenience. Blackwell unleashed his final piece, the man who had conducted the stagecoach robbery, the scarred Confederate veteran known only as Reynolds. The next morning, Catherine Mitchell did not arrive to open the pharmacy. Jack, sensing the wrongness of it in the unnatural quiet of the street, went to her apartment. The door was unlocked, the inside ransacked. On the table, a single brass button, a Confederate Medical Corps button, was placed beside a hastily scrawled note. "The mine at sundown. Come alone. Your move, Captain." And beneath it a small dark stain. Blood. Panic, cold and absolute, seized him. He raced to his house, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The front door hung open, splintered. Inside, the same violent disarray. And on Sophie's small, neatly made bed lay the final devastating message, her favorite rag doll, its head torn from its body. She was gone. Reynolds had not just escalated the war. He had taken it to a place from which there could be no retreat, no negotiation. He had taken Jack's daughter. The button was the key, the piece that finally connected everything: the stagecoach robbery, the stolen locket, the war. This was not about gold, not for Reynolds. This was a vendetta, a ghost from Petersburg or Cold Harbor, a sin from Jack's past, returned to claim its due. He would not go alone, but he would appear to. He sent Deputy Collins to gather the posse, not for a frontal assault, but as a silent perimeter, a net to be drawn tight when the time was right. For himself, he prepared for a different kind of fight. He cleaned his Colt, but also sharpened the knife he hadn't carried in years. He was no longer Sheriff Foster, bound by rules. He was Captain Foster, an instrument of vengeance, preparing to enter the darkness of the abandoned mine, to reclaim his daughter or die trying. The entrance to the Black Creek mine gaped like a mouth to the underworld, a dark wound in the hillside west of town. The Wyoming sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, as Jack approached a lone figure moving through the twilight. He carried a single lantern, its flickering light a fragile beacon against the encroaching darkness. He was a man walking willingly into a trap, because his entire world was inside it. He entered the suffocating blackness of the mine, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. The drip of unseen water echoed from the stone walls, a sound like a slow, erratic clock, counting down the final seconds of his life. The lantern cast monstrous dancing shadows that writhed and leaped, turning familiar rock formations into grotesque specters. The groan of aging support timbers was a constant, mournful sigh from the bones of the earth. He found them in the main cavern, a large chamber where the rock had been hollowed out a generation ago. Reynolds stood by a makeshift table, his scarred face illuminated by the harsh glow of several lanterns. And beside him, tied to a chair, was Sophie. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. But when she saw Jack, a flicker of defiant hope ignited in them. "You came alone," Reynolds observed, his southern cadence, a soft, menacing whisper in the echoing cavern. "I confess I'm surprised." "Let her go, Reynolds." Jack said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. He set his lantern down, his hand hovering near the Colt on his hip. "This is between you and me." "Oh, it is," Reynolds agreed, a cold smile touching his lips. "It has been since the day you murdered my brother." He stepped aside, revealing a third person in the chamber, a man Jack hadn't noticed in the shadows. It was Catherine, bound and gagged, a fresh bruise swelling on her cheek. She had fought them. She had tried to protect Sophie. "My brother, Major Thomas Reynolds, the scarred man," continued, his voice tight with a fanatic's certainty, "was a surgeon, an unarmed medical officer. You shot him through the head while he was tending to wounded men at a field hospital near Petersburg. A coward's work, Captain." The name, the place, had crashed into Jack's memory. The mission had been to eliminate a Confederate general. Blackwell's intelligence had been precise. The target was in that hospital. Jack had taken the shot clean and professional, just as he had been trained to do. The intelligence was wrong. Jack said the words tasting like ash. Your brother was not the target. Wasn't he? Reynolds' laugh was a bitter, broken thing. Or was he just another acceptable loss in one of Colonel Blackwell's grand strategies, like your own men at Cold Harbor? The name of the battle hit Jack with the force of a physical blow. The nightmares, the flashes of confusion and artillery, the sense of being in the wrong place. What do you know about Cold Harbor? Jack demanded. I know everything, Reynolds hissed, his eyes burning with a mad fire. I know that your esteemed Colonel Blackwell received intelligence that the Confederate line was weakest at your position. He also received a second report minutes later that the first was a feint, that the position was in fact the most heavily fortified section of the entire front. He buried the second report. He needed a diversion, a bloody, horrific sacrifice to draw Confederate reserves away from his real point of attack. He sent your unit, Captain Foster's Raiders, into a meat grinder. He knowingly and deliberately sacrificed every single one of your men to win a footnote in a battle. The truth, delivered with such venomous certainty, shattered Jack's world. The ghosts of his past were not just haunting him, they were accusing him. He had not just lost his men to the fog of war, he had led them to a slaughter orchestrated by the man he trusted most. His entire service, every kill, every mission was cast in a new horrific light. He had not been a soldier. He had been a tool, a disposable weapon in the hands of a monster. Rage pure and incandescent flooded him. It was a rage for his fallen comrades, for the years of lies, for the betrayal that had defined his life, without his even knowing it. But as he looked at Sophie, her small face a beacon of innocence, in the corrupt darkness, he knew this was about more than his past. It was about her future. It's over, Reynolds. Jack said, his voice a low growl. He was no longer fighting for just his daughter's life. He was fighting for his soul, for the right to be Sheriff Foster, the protector, not Captain Foster, the killer. For you, perhaps, Reynolds sneered, drawing his pistol and pressing it to Sophie's temple. The cavern exploded into motion. Jack drew and fired in a single fluid act of instinct. His bullet did not strike Reynolds, but the rock wall just beside his head. The impact sent a shower of stone fragments into the man's face, causing him to flinch, to recoil for a fraction of a second. It was all the time Jack needed. He dove forward, not at Reynolds, but at the chair holding Sophie, tipping it backward away from the gun. As Reynolds fired, the bullet screamed through the space where Sophie's head had been a moment before. Jack landed hard, rolling over Sophie, shielding her with his body as he drew the knife from his boot. Reynolds was on him in an instant, the fight devolving into a brutal close-quarter struggle in the flickering lantern light. It was not a sheriff's brawl. It was a soldier's fight to the death. Knives flashed, fists struck with lethal intent. All of Jack's buried training, all the deadly skills Blackwell had honed in him, came roaring back to the surface. He was faster, stronger, his movements sharpened by the twin fuels of righteous fury and profound betrayal. He disarmed Reynolds, the man's pistol clattering away into the darkness. He drove his knife into the man's shoulder, disabling his arm. He fought not just the man, but the ghost of Blackwell, the embodiment of the lies that had cost him everything. He slammed Reynolds against the rock wall, the knife at his throat, the Confederate's life his for the taking. And in that moment, with Reynolds' blood hot on his hands and the screams of his slaughtered unit echoing in his mind, he made a choice. He could kill this man. He could become Captain Foster again, embracing the darkness and the vengeance he was owed. Or he could be the man Sophie believed him to be. He looked at his daughter, who was scrambling to untie Catherine, her small hands working frantically. He saw not fear in her eyes, but a fierce, unwavering faith in her father. He pulled the knife away from Reynolds' throat. He would not give Blackwell another victory by becoming the monster the Colonel had created. "It's over," Jack said again, his voice ragged but firm. He pressed the flat of the blade against the man's cheek, a cold promise. "You're under arrest." He was Sheriff Foster, and his war finally was his own. The courtroom hearing was less a trial and more a public autopsy of Walter Blackwell's ambition. Judge Hiram Parker, a man whose reputation for unbending integrity was carved into the lines on his face, presided over the proceedings with the grim authority of a hanging judge. Jack testified first, his voice steady and clear. He told the whole story from the stagecoach robbery to the final confrontation in the mine. He laid bare Blackwell's deceptions about the gold, Marcus's brutality, and Reynolds' twisted quest for vengeance. When Judge Parker asked him about Cold Harbor, Jack did not hesitate. He told the court about the sacrifice, the betrayal, and the 12 years of lies. He spoke not as a victim, but as a witness. His words a damning indictment of the man who sat impassively at the defendant's table. Catherine testified, her voice clear and precise, detailing the kidnapping and assault. Ezekiel Wilson, frail but resolute, described being shot for defending his home. One by one, the people of Silver Creek spoke their collective testimony, painting a portrait of corporate greed so rapacious it had nearly destroyed their town. Blackwell's expensive lawyers from Cheyenne did their best objecting and posturing, but they were no match for the simple, unassailable truth. When Blackwell himself took the stand, his eloquent justifications and patriotic pronouncements about progress rang hollow in the face of so much testimony to the human cost of his vision. Judge Parker's ruling was swift and absolute. Reynolds was remanded to the territorial prison to await trial for kidnapping and murder. Blackwell's railroad charter was suspended indefinitely pending a federal investigation into charges of fraud conspiracy and his conduct during the war. Silver Creek's future, the judge declared, would be placed in the hands of its people. As federal marshals escorted Ahen-faced Blackwell from the courtroom, the town erupted. It was a victory not of guns or violence, but of law and community. Jack felt a profound sense of relief, of a weight finally lifted. He had faced his past not by burying it deeper, but by dragging it into the light. Derek Sullivan, Blackwell's silent enforcer, was never charged. He had vanished the morning of the hearing, his loyalties ever ambiguous, a ghost slipping back into the shadows from whence he came. That evening, Jack returned home. The house was clean, the broken door repaired by the town carpenter, a pot of stew simmering on the stove left by Mrs. Hollister. The town had closed ranks around him and his daughter. As he stepped onto the porch, he saw something resting on the railing. It was the locket. Rachel's locket. It had been cleaned, its silver surface polished to a soft gleam. There was no note, no explanation. Had Blackwell, in a final complex gesture of remorse, arranged for its return? Or was it Sullivan, a professional courtesy from one survivor to another? Jack knew he would never know for sure. He walked inside and placed the locket on the mantelpiece. It was a piece of his past, a memory to be honored, but no longer a weight to be carried. Sophie came and stood beside him, placing a wildflower she had picked that afternoon in a small vase next to it. The past and the present, side by side. Catherine arrived a few moments later, a basket of fresh bread in her hands and a quiet smile on her face. She took his hand, her grip warm and firm. Together, the three of them stood at the window, looking out at the lights of Silver Creek twinkling in the dusk. The town they had saved, the home they would now build together. Jack Foster looked at his daughter, at the woman beside him, and at the community that had become his own. The war had taken so much, but in its place, he had found something new, something real. He had found peace not in forgetting, but in facing the truth and choosing to be a better man.